Before the 2016 elections, the Republican-led Wisconsin government resorted to an old trick to swing a close election their way. They enacted strict voter ID laws. Over 10% of eligible black voters who failed to vote cited the new law as a reason. This compares with 5.9% for white voters in Milwaukee and Madison, parts of the state that leaned Democrat. It may have prevented up to 23,000 people from voting in those cities and 45,000 statewide. Trump won by only 22,000 votes. Now, it's impossible to say whether Trump would have lost Wisconsin without these strict laws in place. However, it was even cited by Republicans Attorney General Brad Schimmel and Representative Glenn Grothman as a reason why the Republicans were able to edge out a close victory. There was a clear intention to discourage people from voting in order to win an election. What happened in Wisconsin is an example of what we'll be talking about in the second episode on how to fix American democracy, voter suppression. In this episode, we will see how votes are suppressed in contemporary elections and what can be done to prevent this. In the first episode, we stated that the purpose of government is to serve the people. To this end, it must represent the will of the people, serve all people, and actually serve. To represent the will of the people adequately, it clearly makes sense to try and get as many people to vote as possible. However, conniving politicians, cannily realizing that having more people vote might reduce their chances of getting elected, try to manipulate the system so that people who would likely vote against them don't vote at all. This is what voter suppression is. It has been going on since the end of the Civil War in the period known as Reconstruction, when Southern whites, fearing they would lose their power after slaves had been freed and gained the right to vote, started enacting laws that made it very difficult, if not impossible, for blacks to vote. To illustrate its dramatic effect, in the 1880 presidential election, before voter suppression policies were enacted, black voter turnout was higher than white voter turnout in 8 southern states. However, once Reconstruction ended, discriminatory laws such as poll taxes and literacy tests dramatically reduced the number of blacks who could vote. By 1890, only 6% of eligible black voters in Mississippi were registered to vote. In Louisiana, the number of registered black voters went down a whopping 99%, from 130,000 to just 1,342. These discriminatory laws more or less persisted until almost a century later when the federal government passed the Voting Rights Act, which made it difficult for states that had a history of voter suppression to enact new discriminatory laws. However, the ruling on Shelby v. Holder opened the floodgates to new voter suppression laws by making the formula for determining bad-behaving states invalid, a fine example of the Supreme Court leaving a problem for Congress to handle without truly considering the consequences of its actions. While it can be debated how much an effect these new laws have had on specific election outcomes, the fact is these laws make voting more difficult, and party strategists have admitted to this as a tactic to help them win elections. Whether it has affected the outcome of an election to date is beside the point. It's like justifying allowing a kid to play with matches because the house hasn't burned down yet. And the kid has admitted they are trying to burn the house down. This kind of practice has no place in a healthy democracy. There are 3 major ways that voter suppression is carried out in modern times. The first is list purges. Now, voter registration lists do need periodic updating as people move away or pass away in order to ensure fair elections. However, purges often remove people who shouldn't be removed, and these tend to be eligible lower-income voters who are more likely to move and have common last names. The good news is that purges are pretty visible, and most of the time civil liberties groups are able to pressure state governments into implementing measures that mitigate the effects, such as in 2018 when Georgia allowed voters to register and vote on Election Day. As we saw with the example of Wisconsin in 2016, another way to suppress the votes of certain voters is strict voter ID laws. Now, most countries around the world require voters to present some form of photo ID and proof of address when they vote. This is not controversial. The controversy lies in which IDs are accepted. Some groups of voters tend not to have certain forms of identification, such as driver's licenses. For example, in Indiana, 21% of black people do not have a driver's license compared to only 7% of white people. Unscrupulous politicians take advantage of this and make it impossible to vote without that narrow set of identification. In the 2016 election, 9% of black and Hispanic voters were told they lacked the proper identification to vote. For white people, it was only 3%. Yes, voters should need to prove who they are, but there should be many ways of doing this. For instance, Canada allows voters to use 40 different forms of ID. Texas, a state with a history of voter suppression, by contrast, only allows 7, and their selection seems pretty arbitrary. For instance, Texas allows concealed carry permits, yet doesn't allow university student IDs. Now, there are some studies that indicate that the discriminatory effect of strict voter ID is small if there is one. However, this may be because strict voter ID laws encourage organizations that fight against disenfranchisement to mobilize, countering their effect. In some sense, this is good news that citizens are rallying to do the right thing. It would be better, however, if their efforts weren't spent compensating for a broken system. The last form of voter suppression I will touch upon is disenfranchising former felons. Now, it can be debated whether or not current inmates should have the right to vote. However, after someone has done their time, they should have their full rights as a citizen restored. Most states do restore their rights automatically at some point after release. However, in 10 states, the process for restoration is very limited or onerous. This affects over 3 million potential voters across the US. In Florida alone, it affects over 9% of its voting population. This is a significant portion of the population who have served their time, yet are not truly full citizens again. They should have the ability to participate in democracy once again. It should be clear by now that no politician will openly say they don't want a group of people to vote in an election. These days, voter suppression is done much more subtly and often under the pretense of preventing voter fraud. Now, before I can address potential solutions to voter suppression, I need to talk a little bit about voter fraud, especially since the last president made a very big deal about it. Here's the thing about voter fraud. It is important, it does happen, and it's also exceedingly rare. Whether your sources are from the left or the right, they both show the same thing. You are more likely to get struck by lightning than to witness voter fraud. Now, why is this? 1. There are many measures in place to reduce the likelihood of voter fraud. Let me list a few of them. For mail-in ballots, paper ballots, sealed envelopes, secure drop-off locations and ballot boxes, video-surveyed ballot handling, maintained logs and records, mail ballot request authentication, individualized ballot envelopes, ballot tracking, signature verification, sworn affidavits, counterfeit detection, signature curing, provisional mail ballots, protections against ballot box stuffing, registered voter list maintenance, ballot tabulation monitoring, post-election audits. Secondly, it's a lot of work to do at a high risk, and it may not amount to much. The strongest evidence I can find for the potential of voter fraud is when the NYPD did an operation where police officers posed as deceased citizens and were able to have 62 out of 63 officers be successfully able to vote. However, that does not mean voter fraud is rampant, and the NYPD even admitted as much. To actually make a meaningful difference in an election, someone committing voter fraud would need to do it at a much larger scale, making it much more likely they would get caught. And the punishment is pretty severe. The federal punishment alone is $10,000 in fines and up to 5 years of jail time for each count. All of this trouble and risk to do something that likely won't make much of a difference. It should be obvious that there are ways to allow as many people to vote while still maintaining the integrity of elections. Many countries around the world successfully do this. This is not rocket science. To stop voter suppression, we could amend the Voting Rights Act's coverage formula. However, a better solution is to make voter suppression impossible by requiring states to make voting easy for all. This would also be constitutional, as Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution states that states conduct elections, but Congress is allowed to regulate them. There are 3 main ways of doing this that are already practiced successfully in other Western democracies, as well as in certain states. The first is automatic voter registration. Automatic voter registration means when people interact with the government, such as when they go to renew their driver's license, their voter registration information is automatically updated. Not only does this greatly increase the number of people registered to vote, it also reduces errors and costs while improving security and accuracy. Voter list purges, and the controversy associated with them, are no longer necessary as the voter list is constantly being updated. A complement to automatic voter registration is same-day registration. This allows people who haven't interacted with the government recently to be registered on election day so that they can vote. Usually they need to present a combination of photo identification and proof of address. As of the making of this video, 21 states already have this in place. Finally, we can give people many opportunities to vote. Early voting allows people to vote who for whatever reason can't vote on election day. Mail-in ballots are another option that makes it easier for people to vote, and yes, there are many ways to ensure that it is done securely. Finally, some people have suggested making Election Day a federal holiday so that work doesn't stop people from voting. In addition to measures that make it easier for people to vote, we can enfranchise former felons by ensuring they have the right to vote in federal elections after serving their sentences. Again, none of this is rocket science. In fact, most of these are practiced in many states today. What needs to happen is to universalize these practices so that voting is convenient and accessible for citizens in every state. The good news is that there is a bill right now in Congress, which I'll talk about in greater detail in a future episode, called H.R. 1, that requires states to administer all of these things during their federal elections. H.R. 1 would require states to implement automatic voter registration, same-day registration, and early voting. It would also make Election Day a federal holiday. Whether you're from the left or the right, you should recognize that democracy is healthier when as many citizens can participate as possible. Elections should be competitive, and candidates should be focused on delivering policies that resonate with your needs, not on gaming the system in order to secure their hegemony. Voters should be choosing their representatives, not the other way around. Ending voter suppression by making registration automatic and voting convenient is a vital step towards building a stronger union. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like, and if you would like to watch more content that looks at problems in the world and how we can solve them, consider subscribing or supporting me on Patreon. I would also like to give a shout out to the Brennan Center for Justice. They do a lot of great research on election practices and democratic reform. In the next episode, we're going to talk about another sneaky way politicians try to choose their voters that's been discussed ad nauseum. Next time, we'll talk about how to slay the gerrymander.